This is Literary Latte, the podcast with a Southern accent on writing. I'm Linda Bouchard. So, you think you know everything about the Civil War? Well, you won't want to miss a moment of this episode, because joining me today is noted Civil War historian, Georgia native, and the award-winning author, Dr. Joan Cashin, who provides an entirely fresh perspective on the Civil War in her new book titled War Stuff, and we'll dive into it right after this. We're proud to be sponsored by McIntosh Bookshop and the Beaufort Bookstore, located in Beaufort, South Carolina. The success of these stores begins with owner Wilson McIntosh. He's a champion of writers. McIntosh Bookshop is located in the historic district on Bay Street, where it has thrived for over 30 years, specializing in Civil War history, sporting books, and carrying titles by local and regional authors. They also have an amazing rare book collection and a selection dedicated to Pat Conroy's novels. Their sister store, the Beaufort Bookstore, is located on Boundary Street in the business district. Think of it as the hip, modern sister of the Bay Street location. The Beaufort Bookstore carries Southern fiction, a great selection of children's books, popular fiction of all genres, and gift items. If you love books and great bookstores, then be sure and stop by both locations when you're in Beaufort, South Carolina. McIntosh Bookshop and the Beaufort Bookstore, where the best Southern stories begin. Now on to the show. Joining me today is Dr. Joan Cashin, distinguished scholar of 19th century American history and the award-winning author of 7 books, including her most recent, titled War Stuff: The Struggle for Human and Environmental Resources in the American Civil War, where she focuses on what happens off the battlefield when the conflicts of the war show up in all these other places, such as people's homes, on the main square, in the fields, especially in the South. Today, Joan will talk about the beginning of the Civil War on April 12, 1861 at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. She'll tell us why the war began there and why it matters. She'll talk about the interactions between the soldiers and civilians, and then share her thoughts on the collective memory of the post-war South. Joan, welcome. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks very much for that nice introduction, and I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, my pleasure. And your book looks past the traditional narrative and puts a spotlight on a largely unexplored topic regarding the Civil War. Your focus is on the civilians. Why was that of interest to you, Joan?
That's a good question. I've been interested for most of my career in social history, cultural history, economic history, especially the lived experience of the American people, how ordinary people experience their lives. And off and on for years, when I was doing research on different projects, I kept coming across references to this struggle that was going on during the war between armies on the one side and civilians on the other. And they were struggling over resources, over the basic stuff that you need to wage war, like food, timber, the built environment. So I discovered that just as there was a military struggle going on as the two armies squared off against each other, that there was a parallel struggle going on between the armies and the civilians.
Right. And so you gave us a brief definition of that war stuff, as you put it. Just elaborate on that a little bit and talk about the interaction because you give a beautiful example of that right at the beginning of your book. And so maybe talk about a little bit of the interaction between the civilians and the soldiers, because really most of the soldiers were civilians. So, right?
Yes. Well, most of them were not career military. It's an army for both the North and the South. It's composed mostly of people who have never been in combat before. And what I discovered is that neither army is very good at supplying the men in the field, getting the rations to them that they have to survive. I mean, human beings need food to survive, obviously. So these are armies that don't have modern means of communication or transportation. They're often relying on wagon trains. Sometimes the wagons break down, they get lost, they get ambushed. If they're using railroad lines, sometimes the railroad trains also malfunction or get ambushed. So the armies are never very efficient when it comes to getting food to the men out in the field. And when that happens, the men in both armies turn to civilians. They turn to the civilian population. And they have the right to do that under the Articles of War, which were drafted in 1806, and both armies abide by the Articles of War. They have the right to take supplies from civilians, but there's supposed to be certain procedures that are followed. An officer is supposed to be present. Paperwork is supposed to be given out describing the kind of property that was seized and how much it was worth and the date and so on. And then there was the promise of compensation. The civilian would get compensation at some time, either during the war or after the war. But what I discovered is that men in both armies frequently disregard those procedures. Often men in the ranks will decide the rations haven't arrived and it's time for them to go out and find something on their own. So they will slip away from camp. Sometimes they do it at night. And they go to the closest farm and they confiscate what they need. And they're hoping that they don't have any contact with civilians. And oftentimes they don't. But sometimes civilians who are present notice this right away, or they hear it. They hear strange noises out in the barn. And oftentimes there's a confrontation. Civilians will say, you don't have the right to take that. And the soldiers reply, yes, we do. And even when the foraging expedition is done according to regulations, the officer in charge asserts that military needs come first. The phrase that they use over and over again is military necessity. If the military needs something, the military has the right to take it. And one thing that really surprised me is that Confederate troops are willing to take from white Southerners who are pro-Confederate, and Union troops are willing to take from white Southerners who are pro-Union. And we do have to remember that there are always some white Southerners who are against secession, against the Confederacy. They're still pro-Union. I argue that it's maybe 30 to 40% of the population. It's a minority, obviously, but those people maintain that the whole thing is a mistake. They're against it from the beginning of the war to the end. But what I discovered is that the political loyalties of the civilian population don't really matter very much, that men in both armies are willing to take what they need from civilians regardless of their political allegiances.
Wow. And so that is such an interesting dynamic. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about the politics and the start of the war and the politics surrounding it, Joan. What was the main issue in the presidential election of 1860?
That's a great question. The main issue was, shall slavery go west? Shall slavery expand into the trans-Mississippi West? That was the main issue in 1860. It was not abolition per se. No abolitionist ever would have been nominated by either party in 1860. That was considered to be the extreme left-wing position in the political spectrum of that time period. Obviously, it's a different universe. It's completely different from the world that we live in today. And the anti-slavery candidate is Abraham Lincoln. His position and the position of the Republican Party is the expansion of slavery has got to stop, meaning no more additional slave states out west. The Democratic Party split in two and ran two different candidates at the same time. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's frenemy from Illinois, these two men had known each other for a long time, and they were not on very good terms. But Douglas said, let the decision be made at the territorial stage. People will vote on it at that stage, and then President Douglas, if he gets into the White House, will approve whatever they say. And Douglas is indifferent on this issue. He never really understood why anybody would get worked up about slavery. And then the Vice President of the United States, John Breckinridge, ran for president as a Democrat. And he says slavery must and shall expand. And if anybody tries to stop the expansion of slavery, then the slave state should consider secession. Although he occasionally waffled on that point, he wasn't entirely consistent. But he's the only candidate who will come out and say, at least some of the time, that secession should be an option. And then there was John Bell. And poor John Bell is sort of the forgotten man of 1860. He was a former U.S. Senator from Tennessee, and he was deeply disturbed by what Breckinridge was saying about secession. So his position was the country must be preserved, the Union must be preserved, and no political issue is important enough to justify secession. So when the vote takes place, Lincoln wins New England, the Midwest, the Far West, but the slave states divide. And John Bell does surprisingly well. It surprised a lot of his contemporaries, certainly. He won Tennessee, his own state. He won Virginia, the oldest state. He won Kentucky, which was the native state of both Lincoln and Breckinridge. He lost Missouri by a couple of hundred votes, and he lost North Carolina by a couple of thousand votes. And he got about a third of the vote in Alabama. So that's a signal that there are thousands of voters out there who are ambivalent about secession or openly hostile to it. And that's one thing that plagues the Confederacy from the beginning.
Right. And I was going to ask you, too, to that, did the white Southerner, the public, support secession and the Confederacy? Well,
there's a significant minority that is against it from the very beginning. And the term that people used back then was unionist, the word union with IST on as the suffix, meaning pro-union white Southerner. And civilians and military people are fully aware of their existence. This shows up in the correspondence throughout the war. Everybody's aware that there is that segment of the population that is against secession and against the Confederacy. But the irony is that all civilians, regardless of their political loyalties, do get exploited by both armies. And what happens? And what happens over the course of the conflict is that the demands of the armies get bigger and bigger, and civilians come to see all armies as posing a potential threat to them. So regardless of how somebody may have voted in 1860, they realized by about 1863 that the presence of an army in your neighborhood means that you might lose all of your cattle. They might take down your fence rails. They might even take over your house. and use it for a hospital or military headquarters or whatever.
Right. And so now that we've laid that groundwork, let's bring it to the South and explain to us why the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and why did it matter?
That's another good question. South Carolina is the state that secedes first. It leaves in December 1860, ahead of everybody else. And South Carolina had political leadership that was known to be especially pro-slavery, especially vocal in defending the states' rights philosophy. And in fact, South Carolina had discussed the possibility of secession in the 1830s. The state's political leadership got into a dispute with President Andrew Jackson, and eventually they backed down. But in 1860, they're leading the way. They secede ahead of everybody else. So South Carolina has special symbolism for that reason. And the military installation, Fort Sumter, is guarding Charleston Harbor. So the possession of that particular fort means a lot to people on both sides. And the fort was occupied in 1860 by U.S. troops, of course, headed by Robert Anderson. And he is holed up in there and doesn't evacuate when the state secedes. And there is an attempt at some sort of negotiation, but Anderson will not surrender. So the shelling begins at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. The shelling, this is actually the first set of shots fired during the war on April 12th. And the very next day, Anderson surrenders. So all eyes are trained on Charleston because many people perceive it as the cradle of secession.
And Lincoln, if I recall my history, didn't think they would really fire on Fort Sumter. What was his stance on that? Because although he hated slavery, he was far from an abolitionist.
Well, Lincoln is a moderate by the standards of 1860. He's against the expansion of slavery into the far west. But as you say, he was not an abolitionist. But Lincoln is against secession, strongly against it. He thinks it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, and he is determined to keep the Union together. And he makes remarks in the early part of the war, well into 1862, that is his primary purpose, to keep the Union together. But Lincoln knows that there are pro-Union white Southerners out there, and he kept hoping that maybe the Confederacy would break up from within, that there might be states or parts of states that would rejoin the United States. The way that West Virginia split off from Virginia. The state of Virginia in 1860 included what is now West Virginia. And that part of the state was strongly pro-Union. So they seceded from Virginia to go back into the U.S., and Lincoln was hoping that might happen in places that had heavy pro-Union sentiment, like western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, northern Alabama. But that doesn't happen, and historians have always sort of puzzled about that. It seems to be the case that pro-Union white Southerners tend to either join the Union Army or they join pro-Union guerrilla outfits. So for the first year or so, Lincoln is hoping that maybe the whole thing will collapse. Maybe the Confederacy will just kind of fall apart from its own internal pressures, but that doesn't happen. So it seems to be the case that in early 1862, he starts thinking about some kind of emancipation measure, and he finally issues it in September, but he initially made the offer to border states that remained in the Union, We must remember that there are 4 slave states that stay in the U.S., Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. A lot of people forget that. It's not a war of slave states versus free states. If that were true, everything would have been so much easier for President Lincoln. But he, in March of 1862, he offers those 4 slave states compensated emancipation, that the federal government will compensate them for the value of their slaves. That's how the British did it when they abolished slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s. When Lincoln was a congressman in the 1840s, he had drafted a bill to do the same thing, to end slavery in Washington, D.C., but it never went anywhere because he was only a one-term congressman. He didn't get reelected. But in the spring of '62, when he makes that offer to the border states, every single state turned him down. Everyone said no. And then he made the offer again in June of '62. They turned him down again. And then in July of '62, he told his cabinet that he was planning on some kind of emancipation measure, and he issues it in September. And even then, it's kind of a complicated piece of legislation. He says that if the states in rebellion do not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, then the slaves in those places will be emancipated. So that there's an escape clause. He's giving them that option. And historians have debated, did Lincoln really expect that there would be any takers? There weren't any takers. As best we can tell, there's no serious discussion by any major political leaders inside the Confederacy on that point. So it goes into effect January 1, 1863, but it doesn't cover the border states in the Union, and it doesn't cover places inside the Confederacy that were occupied by the Federal Army. It covers those places in rebellion. So it's a complicated measure, but you can see here how methodical Lincoln is and how careful he is. He's a careful, cautious politician on this issue because he knows that it will be extremely controversial, even in the North. And it was.
And indeed, right. The attack on Fort Sumter rallied the North to the defense of American nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
So,
although there were plenty of Northerners who were pro-Union, but nonetheless against emancipation. And the Northern Democratic Party was quite critical of Lincoln on this point, and so were some conservative Republicans. There were Northern Republicans who didn't support this idea, and a couple of them tried to talk him out of it. And one of them said, "You don't have the authority to do this." And Lincoln said, "I believe I do."
Right, as presidents are wont to do, right, Joan?
Yes. And he said that, we're in a state of crisis, and he had the power as the commander-in-chief to keep the country together, and he presents emancipation as a way to undermine the enemy, as a way to weaken the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. So, Lincoln is a very subtle personality. He's more complicated, I think, than most of us learned in grade school or high school. The way that I remember learning about him was that he was this good-hearted country lawyer. And yes, he is good-hearted, and yes, he was a lawyer, but Lincoln is a very sophisticated political figure. And he's also in this extremely difficult situation. There's no guidance in the Constitution. There's no paragraph in the Constitution that says this is what the president should do in case the country breaks up.
Yes, and that speaks to his inner compass and his character. And that knowledge comes out in his writings because he was one of the most
Hmm.
nuanced and brilliant writers for having so little education. So there was a
Hmm.
lot of intuitiveness to him.
Yes.
Um, my guest is Dr. Joan Cashin, historian and author of the new book, War Stuff, The Struggle for Human and Environmental Resources in the American Civil War. After we take a short break, we'll talk about the collective memory of the post-war South. I'm Linda Bouchard, and this is Literary Latte.
Hey, author, want to get your latest title published as an audiobook on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes? You can do it. Just reach out to audiobook.solution.com.
As I travel the back roads and highways around the South, I'm always amazed at the quality of local festivals that take place, and here's one that's at the top of my list now. The North Charleston, South Carolina Arts Fest takes place May 1st through 5th, and the multi-day celebration highlights national, regional, and local artists in the areas of music, theater, and literature. You'll find workshops, exhibitions, and activities in a variety of venues, including Charleston's beautiful parks. This is one of the most comprehensive arts festivals in the state, with a schedule that offers something for everyone. You can discover more at northcharlestonartsfest.com. Let's get back to my interview with Dr. Joan Cashin, author and historian, whose book, War Stuff, takes us beyond the traditional narrative of the Civil War. Joan, talk a little bit about the interaction with the civilians and the soldiers, and do you think the struggle between them had an effect on the outcome of the war?
Oh, yes, I do, definitely. I think what happens eventually is that the infrastructure in the region just starts to break down. And the damage to the physical environment, to the material resources of the region, is so great that the region loses its ability to wage war. And it also, the conflict also undermines morale. It undermines the willingness of even pro-Confederate white Southern civilians to keep fighting, to keep struggling. When you get down to basic questions about physical survival, most people are not willing to sacrifice that for ideology, for a political goal. And if a civilian has to choose between helping out an army and the survival of their own household, protecting their own family members, they will protect their own family members. That's an existential choice that war often forces upon people.
Mm-hmm.
And by the spring of 1865, most white Southern civilians are ready for this thing to be over.
So what did they, the white civilian population, give up on after the Civil War?
Well, after the war is over, I argue in the book that there's a period of a year or so where civilians are willing to speak directly and honestly about what has happened, what happened to them. You find people admitting in their private correspondence and conversations with journalists that both armies took from them, and that the suffering that the war inflicted on civilians was enormous, and it was just too much. It was just too much for society to endure. But then, relatively quickly, this series of distortions begins to crop up, a series of related fantasies that historians call the lost cause mythology. The idea, first of all, that all white Southerners supported secession and supported the Confederacy. That isn't true. That's well documented. And also that they supported it to the very end of the war. That's also not true. And that the damage that was inflicted upon the region came from only one army, and it was the Federal Army. You know, it was the ravenous Federal troops who took all the food and chopped down trees and took over the housing stock and so forth. And that's not true either. But lots of nations do this. You know, when a society loses a war, it's often traumatizing, and people will often generate these kinds of mythologies to make it easier to bear. And that's what white Southerners, especially if they were pro-Confederate, that's what they started to do after the war. And they're very good at shaping the collective memory. And that series of ideas got into the bloodstream, you know, not just in the region, but also in the country at large. And it got into the textbooks. And that was really the way the war was taught until maybe, 40 years or so, when we finally started to get a more accurate view of the war.
Right. And let's talk about that. The collective memory of the post-war South. It turned out to be as complicated as the war itself. Right?
Yeah, yes. Yes, it is. I mean, wars are complicated by their very nature. There always are dissenters. There are always people who don't get on board. We saw that with the Revolution. Approximately a third of the population was loyal to the British Empire. In the War of 1812, New England Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut, to plan secession from the United States during the war. When the war was still going on with England. Then the war ended, so that cut off the secession movement, but it destroyed the Federalist Party. Their reputation was ruined by that. In the Mexican War, there was a vocal anti-war movement. Henry David Thoreau in Concord, Mass. went to jail rather than pay taxes to support the war.
Right.
He was very strongly against that war. So there have always been dissenters when the country has gone to war. But I think what happens with white Southerners is the Civil War is such a trauma. It's so damaging and it's so destructive. And afterwards, people want to figure out a way to make that less painful and to make the war more glamorous. And if you make the argument that everybody united and fought against the common enemy, that makes it sound more glamorous. But that is not, in fact, true.
That revisionist history.
Well, history's always being revised. I mean, the scholarship of the United States is an ongoing enterprise. It's a dynamic scholarship, and we're always finding new documents. In the 1980s, for example, the last living descendant of Abraham Lincoln died, his great-grandson. And in the attic of his house, there were 40,000 manuscripts pertaining to Abraham Lincoln's life.
Really?
Mostly, yes. I mean, it's astonishing. I mean, thank goodness there was never a house fire. But,
absolutely.
I know, and most of those documents pertain to Lincoln's legal career. I mean, it was basically his files from his career as an attorney. So historians found out a lot about Lincoln as a lawyer. And that knowledge has just been formulated in the last generation or so. So our knowledge and our perspective of the war is always changing.
Good point, Joan. So in closing here, Joan, what is the one takeaway you want readers to gain as they come to the end of your book?
I guess two things. One point would be that war almost always inflicts serious damage on material resources and on the environment. And the other point would be that there are always people who are dissenters in time of war.
Great. And it's stunning that as sweeping and analyzed as the Civil War is, that we are still discovering new things. Dr. Joan Cashin, thank you for being my guest and for your fascinating perspective on the Civil War.
Oh, thank you, Linda. I really enjoyed it.
War Stuff. The Struggle for Human and Environmental Resources in the Civil War is published by Cambridge University Press. I'll have more about Joan Cashin along with a link to her website in the show notes. For Literary Latte, I'm Linda Bouchard. Until next time, stay tuned and stay curious. Thanks to our sponsors, McIntosh Bookshop and the Beaufort Bookstore, two of the best independent bookstores in the South. McIntosh Bookshop and the Beaufort Bookstore, where the best Southern stories begin. If you haven't already, please go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me next time for another conversation with a publishing industry insider. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Literary Latte with Linda Bouchard. For more information, visit bookingauthorsinc.com.